Hi everybody, welcome to Great Horse of Steel. My name is Ian Ellis and I'm just going to be focusing on Cezanne's colour mixing. We'll look a little bit at the technique as well and try and think about the colour contrast a little bit as well. I mean, if you're looking at Cezanne's painting, this is the actual still life with fruit bowl painted in 1879 to 80, taken in quite a long time to do. But if you look at the painting, you can see there's very much a kind of warm and cool contrast in the painting. Lots of blue and lots of warm colours. Blue perhaps dictates a little bit, takes over the painting, and there's bits of warm appearing in the painting. What's interesting about Cezanne is when I was doing studying his work a few years ago, I came across the technical bulletin team of the National Gallery, and what they done a listed one of the paintings they got in the National Gallery, Mountains at Provence, where they listed how he mixed, and I was really surprised to see how much he was using black. So he wasn't really following, say, the two colour mixing the way, say, Monet would do, or maybe Hopper as well. But it'd be using black. So it'd be using like an old master palette mixing, using black, which we'll look at in the future. I think we're going to be looking at Lucian Freud soon enough, and you'll see how black can be used for using a very small palette. But he's using it with a really big palette, so it's kind of mixed between the two. He's got the list of colours you see in Monet's palette, but he's also got black and white, and the black will be then used to darken the colours. Now, what's really odd is the fact there's no evidence whatsoever in any of his mixing. I've looked at the technical bulletin team of complementary mixing, which is complementary mixing was the thing at the time. It was kind of everybody was kind of beware of how you can make a black using two complementary colours. I spoke a bit about that in the last one I did on Luc Tuymans. And what you'll find is that instead of using complementaries, he's using black. So I'm using a bit of white. So he's not just using black, say like Matisse would do to darken the blue. He would use it to actually make a grey as well, and make a grey tone, we call a tone colour mixed with grey. So what we've got is a few grey tones in here, and you'll see this at the back here. Now what I've done to start my painting, I've put down yellow ochre with white with acrylic paint, and I used a felt tip paint to trace this image. So I'll very quickly do a little colour study. I won't do the whole painting. I'll say what I'll do is a little bit, some fragments of it. A bit like the way Cezanne paints. He will start with little details, bring in a few colours around the painting to hold it together. But you'll see him focusing in little parts. And one of the strengths of Cezanne's paintings, what made him really quite unique, was what we call the negative space, which again I mentioned that in the last one with Luc Tuymans' paintings, where the negative space really is as powerful. A bit around the back is painted just as much as the object. So there isn't a kind of like a definition of an object, so like you find on a realist painter, and the background being less important, where there may be a few marks or simple flat colours and lots of work gone into the real into the object. But what he's doing is got lots of broken paint divided equally around the painting. A bit like the Impressionists. He was actually he learned how to paint like this, actually going out painting with Pissarro, his friend, and he actually copied one of Pissarro's paintings, and it seemed to, I don't know what it is happened with Cezanne, he seems to understand the spatial kind of idea of the whole thing, which makes him quite unique, and this is something we won't cover at the moment, but we're just looking at the technique, and I'm just going to go for a bit of the mixing. The palette I've got here, the huge palette, if you want to look it up yourself, you'll find it's a palette by Emile Bernard. He actually is about 30 colours, so I won't list them, it'd be too much. But if you look at that up for yourself, you can actually see the huge list of palettes, list of colours that used for his palettes. And obviously, I think what he'd do, if he'll select colours from that big range. And this one I've selected colours like yellow ochre, burnt sienna, vermilion, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, cobalt blue. I've got Prussian blue there as well. Viridian green, emerald green. Emerald green is a real favourite of Cezanne's. You see a lot of his paintings. Really likes his colour. I think it was quite a new colour at the time. And we call it brilliant yellow. What I've done, I've mixed my lemon yellow with cadmium yellow to get this yellow slightly more in between. Now I'm going to start with the grey colours. Say someone like Van Gogh or Monet perhaps use complementary colours, oranges and blues, or the brown and the blue. But again, there's no evidence of that. So what I'm going to do is just go the way that Cezanne would paint it, would mix it, and go for the mix the colour first and in pure sense, perhaps using the emerald green with the ultramarine blue to get the green. A green blue I've got down here, bit of white with it, so we can see the colour. And then this colour is actually in there. I can grey that colour using mixing of black and white. Just a little bit more blue there with that to make it more of a blue-grey. I'm getting these colours in there. Just a little bit of hint of blue with it. Now I'm just going to look at some of these other blues in the background there. I've got the emerald green with the blue to get the darker colour, and I can keep adding the green to get the range of different blues in there, slightly going towards more of a green. I just see bits of green around the back. This is a bit darker around here, and going a bit lighter over that side, which I've already got. Don't need to use any black just yet. Here we've got the dark brown here. I'm going to look at that. I've got the viridian green or the emerald green I could use to get the dark yellow brown. So I'm going to go for the burnt sienna with the ultramarine blue. Sorry, with the viridian green, and you get this really lovely dark browns with a kind of lovely kind of going off towards more yellowish browns in there, going towards more green. And think about it, when you darken a brown, if it starts moving more greenish, it's actually going over the yellow. If it will never hit green, it will it's the opposite colour, but you will get kind of, if I keep adding a bit of green to that, I can see I've got, it goes to a lovely kind of yellow, dark yellow colour, rather than with you see that as a green. And you can see this kind of movement between the colours in there. Some colours are a bit lighter, a bit of emerald green with the brown. Bit of white with it. You can just see these, not much white. Brown's a bit of a dodgy colour with white, you've got to be really careful with it. But that's just bringing me some of those browns down there. It's something to do with, it gets a bit very pasty quite easily. And you see there's yellow ochre in there as well. So with the yellow ochre, the movement of colour you can see between the sienna and the brown, using bits of white. So just keep using a white, just try and grey it slightly. These colours down there. Again, yellow ochre on its own with white. Perhaps a little bit yellow with it, just to make it more white. You get these colours slightly more yellow, just moving across, so you can see the colour mix shifting across there. Looking a bit strong just down there, a tiny bit of black needed, just to, not much, be careful with the black, you've got to be so careful with it. See how dirty it goes. That's more like it, just getting a bit more, just a tiny bit of black. But you see how I just dab the black onto my palette knife? It's just something I do to take off the amount of black. So I've just got a tiny bit of black. And learning to mix colours really is, again, keep stressing this, it's tiny bits added to find the colour, rather than if you're a bit clumsy with the mixing, which you can, I mean, I'm guilty of, as you see when I'm painting, you're trying to rush a colour a bit, trying to get it, but see those lovely combinations of colours over there. And these are quite similar to the colours in the apples as well. So that's a way of holding the painting together. If you notice, it's got these blue greens, they're in the cloth as well. And it's a kind of device a lot of painters were using in Impressionist painting. There's pointillists were doing the same thing. We're holding the paint together with colours repeated around the painting. So there's no coincidence, there's the same yellow ochres over here in the fruit. A little bit of stuff of ochre in the back there, that will help hold it together a little bit as well. Some lovely colours there, you can see those already straight away, they're looking great. Well, let's go for the reds. The reds look to me quite strong. It may be just a little bit of a sienna with the red itself. They're looking very strong. If I use that sort of vermilion, looking very strong. So obviously this is a print. It might be a bit brighter. I'm looking at print there, but I'm going for the colour in the print. And if I was going to darken that, could I usually use a bit of brown? So I don't need to use a black. A bit of brown might do it. A bit of white maybe. Just to, again, calm it down again. Back to the brown. And that's calming it down. It's not too bad. A bit more brown. It's amazing how dull these colours are. Our brain naturally sees them as quite bright. Looks a little bit. I go a bit of the red looks. My red look maybe it's a bit too orange. So I'm putting a bit of alizarin crimson with that just to bring it back over to the red. I've just gone over to brown, so that's more like it. And again, there's lovely combinations of colours, aren't they? We're straight away within that. Now, one thing to look at is Cezanne. So I mentioned the negative space, but there's also what we call the hidden edges. This is something you see in a lot of paintings, a lot of classical painters. They hold the painting together by letting one thing run into another, and you can see the whole painting of the blue breaks into this vase. You can hardly see the bowl there. That's just the end of the edge of the actual blue, and obviously the glass is hidden as it would be because all the colours around the back. But this is a way in where your eye comes around the painting and gets a wonderful movement in the painting, which is the flat movement you get in Cezanne's work. It's where he gets your eye to travel around. I would call him an abstract painter, really. He's a realism there, but he's doing it in an abstract way, and is very much aware of how flat the world is and appears to us, and is actually emphasising that. But it's funny, David Hocking talks about the difference between Caravaggio and Cezanne, and you look at the two, and if you compare the two, he compares the two, and I think he's right to say I think Cezanne's paintings actually look more real than Caravaggio's Basket of Fruit. He uses as an example, and they look really super real. I mean, especially from where you are, you'll be looking at it from a distance, and they look really. It's quite a big painting, but I do think they're an amazing paintings. Cezanne's quote was it? He wanted to conquer the world with an apple. Well, he did. It's really quite amazing paintings. Just painting apples, the most banal things in the world, making them the most beautiful thing to paint. We'll just play with the space. Now, I'm just going to do a little bit of painting. What I've found with the technique of Cezanne, I call him a semi-opaque glazer, if you know what I mean. Sometimes the paints are put on quite opaque and heavily, but sometimes it's getting the amount of liquid on the paint. And what I've got here is a mix between zest and, or if you could use white spirit or turps, with linseed oil. Now, zested is really strong, so what I have to do is put more linseed oil with it, because what happens if you mix them together, if you just use the oil, I think it'd be too glossy, too shiny. And if you just use the zest or terps, it will just come out matte. So if you mix them together, when it dries, it should still look like the paint's just come out the tube. And I think it's more like skin kind of sheen, a kind of eggshell quite quality, if you like that, if you don't lose the quality of the colour. Now, if the colours fade, that's what happens, is if you use your terps or zest, the colours will fade. But with Cezanne, glazing traditionally is not using white. You use colours you use your white underneath or the dark colours underneath, and you glaze over the top. But with Cezanne, what I do is mix colours with white and do kind of like semi-glaze. So the colour underneath, this one. It's a very light yellow ochre, or like a Naples yellow. It should slightly come through, especially where the warm colours are. So they get that coming through. So you don't kill the painting by putting on paint too thick. I'll just do a little example. Say if I put that paint if I put a little bit of oil with my paint, do the same thing. You can see it looks lighter. Perhaps hard to see where you're looking, but it's just quite a bit thinner. It's just a bit thinner, just enough for that to come through. And that's one of the things how he manages to get his paintings to glow. Rather than say, look, you get the warm and cool, and you've got the kind of complementaries, you've got the idea of green and blue, which he seems to know about, which is odd why he'd never actually mixed them. He perhaps didn't want to mix the opposites to get the black. But he's certainly aware of complementaries, and he's quite aware of the effects of light and shade on your eye. And so complementary, you can see that's a green blue, that's a warm red, mix those together, you get black, which he doesn't do. Anyway, I'm just going to put a little bit of paint on. And when it's painting, you can see it's got little brush marks. Again, and those little brush marks function as a kind of spatial thing because they overlap each other the way the objects do, and they create space. A bit like a landscape painting, if anything else, where you wouldn't expect to see that kind of atmosphere in a painting where everything goes back in depth with the blue. But he was obsessed with his landscape paintings, and the landscape paintings, I think, come into his still life. So it gets them, kind of makes them a bit surreal as well, and creates loads of space. So you wouldn't get that depth of blue, but you would do in a landscape, and he's putting that into his painting, and it makes them really beautiful paintings. But I would put Cezanne down as a landscape painter, really. Even though he loves the life, but the way he paints portraits, there's a sense of kind of distance and aerial perspective, which helps create this strange kind of space. Now, like I can see when I've got to make sure each brush mark I have a very strong line, and I go back. And what you're attempting to do is to actually keep working on the painting until the paint goes too dry, but don't do that. You've got to keep putting paint on. So it takes time. You take ages doing this painting because making sure the brush marks were right. But it's a very magical thing looking at Cezanne painting, because when they come together are really, really exciting. I've copied a few of them before, and they really are. I would recommend everyone to do them because it's really a treat to look at how these things are so flat, but how spatial they look as well, which is really quite the beauty. Now, just going to go for a few whites in there as well. I'm going to put some light darks in there. So I've got the white paint with some blue, just a bit of blue within the white. And that looks lovely against you can see that colour coming through. It looks a bit too green blue, so I'm going to put a bit more of a white in there, a cleaner white, and put a bit more ultramarine with it. So I was looking for this brush, it was in my hand. Okay, so just a little bit. I'm using my brush to mix, was a bit naughty, but I'm just looking at you should be using a palette knife really if you want to be. And you've got this really powerful white, really loads of white, makes the cloth look more kind of looks a little bit too pure actually. I think if you can try using white, but you can see it still looks a bit too grey. So I'm just going to put a little bit of black with that just to get it a bit greyer, and a bit more green blue as well with that. Still looks a little bit, bring more of this grey I had before with the blue, green, blue, grey. That's better, and I can start bringing that blue. It looks a little bit more purple when it's greyer. That's the thing that threw me a bit. And clean brush and going for some of those blues at the back again. I'm looking for these blue colours around the back here, breaking into the pot, using a little bit more liquid. It's not so dry, the paint. Some of it is though, you can see he's got a few dry points in there. And I'm working up to the negative. Clean my brush. And then some of these ochres appearing in the fruit. And I'm going to go for a very dark colour very quickly, bringing in the black, brown, a dark brown green I've mixed earlier. And the negative space is very important here to bring that forward. Again, it's so important, even the dark areas, to get the broken brush marks. You can see there's more other colours breaking in with the brown I've got there I'm using. And again, there's some much darker colours in between some of the fruit at the back. Very important to get these dark colours on quite early, because then you can see how bright the other colours need to be. So if you were doing this, I mean, it's easy for me because I'm copying the painting, but when you're doing your own painting, what's very difficult is to control the quality, the light and darks in the painting, how dark they need to be. The problem is if you didn't put the dark colours in, then you perhaps make all the other colours too light. So trying to get the brightness. So when you bring the darkness in, your own painting, you're actually controlling the contrast in your painting, so you can see how bright other reds need to be. So I bring in my reds now. Need to clean my brush. Bit more liquid. And this looks very bright when you sit up against these browns. You see, perhaps maybe if I'd not put the dark colours in there, I'd perhaps go a little bit, you see him controlling the painting around it just a little bit. And some of these dark colours I've got against the apple, breaks into the apple here. And this is where you've got to be brave enough to do this. So allow that to happen, where you've got it actually literally goes over the edge. And a lot of students I've found when they're painting find that really hard to do, to actually go over an edge, let it break in. Line as well is important for Cezanne. And when he's using line, the line isn't like a cartoon line, it's like a negative. So the line of this is like a negative shape of that, or it's part of the object, part of the knife. So you've got that edge becomes part of the apple here, but then there's another negative shape, it's around the back. So the line always functions like, just here you've got this dark blue in the glass, it's actually part of the background, that part blue, and then part of the glass this side. So it's controlling the space of the painting. Just going through a few more really dark colours now. I'm going to go from a black, let's get these dark colours around the back here, this really heavy black I've got there. And there's a lot of drawing going on here. And again, the line, and that line is something really interesting, because what it does, when you put a line in the painting, our eye naturally follows around it, so that helps create movement. So you can see he enjoys the line in the decoration in the back of the painting, which I would bring in looking at that. But just to finish off, I'm just going to do a little bit mixing with the emerald green and the ochre to get the green of the apple, and I think it's just a little bit white with it. So I've got the emerald green, and this will set all the colours off nicely. Excuse a big brush, a bit too big, that brush. I'm just putting it in very quickly, very loosely there, which is a few more colours around here and in the back there. And you can see the painting starting to look balanced, a little bit of the same greens in the back around the painting, a little bit in the cloth as well, so it's kind of holding it together. Anyway, you can see how it's developing, and obviously I'd recommend you to have a go. I mean, it's not necessarily this painting, but it's really such a great painting to look at, and there's still life you can set at home. And during lockdown, you could really do a bit of painting, set something up, and see if you can do some painting, maybe using the same palette. It's up to you. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that, everybody. Remember, don't forget to subscribe, and the next painting I've been looking at is Guernica, and it's the second one of the interpretation videos. So I hope you enjoyed that, so I look forward to seeing you then. Bye, everybody.